If Tracy McGrady had stayed longer with the Toronto Raptors and thus extending the tenure of the duo between himself and Vince Carter, would the Raptors have won a championship? Let's find out. What is up, everybody? Jacob Peterson here with Amateur Hour Sports, where we give you raw and unfiltered sporting content Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. So if it is your first time here with me today and you like what you see, maybe you're interested in more insight and opinion on the sporting world, and maybe sometimes some informative videos on the history of sport, make sure you are subscribed to Amateur Hour Sports. So about a month ago, Tracy McGrady was quoted to have said that if he had stayed longer in Toronto playing with Vince Carter, they would have for sure won an NBA championship. And that sparked quite a bit of debate at the time. It has kind of resurfaced in the last few days, so I wanted to give my own take. I've been thinking about doing this video for a while, so here we go. Well, first of all, say what you want about the management in Toronto at the time, but if Tracy McGrady had wanted to stay, and if the Raptors, well, according to him, could have won a championship if he stayed, nobody made him leave, really. If he really wanted to stay, he could have stayed and he would have stayed. Ultimately, he didn't want to be second fiddle to Vince Carter in Toronto and decided he wanted to move on and be his own man. And if that was on a worse team, so be it. He wanted to be the star. But here's the reality with Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady. They both needed to be the second player on an elite duo in a championship roster. Neither of them, I think, were good enough to be that elite first piece. They all needed to be the Kyrie to the LeBron, the Klay Thompson to the Steph Curry, the Tony Parker to the Tim Duncan. The list goes on. They were not the elite piece. They needed to be that second one, but they never had that. Both players never actually played in an NBA final. Tracy McGrady got to one with the Spurs, but he was not a factor on that team. He was just a guy whose name was on the roster at that point. Vince Carter left Toronto and went to an elite New Jersey Nets team, one that had been to the finals twice in years prior to that trade, and he never got to a final with that team, being the best player on that team, the piece that was supposed to push them onward into that elusive NBA championship, and he could never quite get that done. And I love Vince Carter with all my heart. He's one of the greatest Raptors of all time. I have him third on my list of greatest Toronto Raptors, but the reality is he was never quite on that tier to push the Raptors to the next level. He never got them to the conference final. I know he was a three-pointer away from doing so, but they didn't get there. Now, had Vince Carter had Tracy McGrady in his prime playing with him, maybe the story would have been different, but let's look more in depth to this. This was a very bad time to win an NBA championship. You had the Phil Jackson-led Los Angeles Lakers with prime Shaq and basically prime Kobe playing there. Like, who the hell would have guarded Shaq on the Toronto Raptors? I mean, nobody could guard Shaq in the entire association at that point, not to mention that they also had a guy named Kobe Bryant. And if you go past that era, you have the gritty defense, hard-nosed Pistons of that time who beat that Lakers team in 5 games. That Lakers team who had 4 Hall of Famers playing for them, albeit they weren't all in their prime, but a great Lakers team with Shaq, Kobe in their prime, Gary Payton, who was regressing, admittedly, and Karl Malone, who was regressing as well, but still, Pistons in 5 over that Lakers team, that was a real deal Pistons team for sure. With such tremendous defense on that team, I don't think the Raptors would have been able to cope without that elite piece that they were missing, because the Lakers had 2 elite pieces and they couldn't even get past that defense. Then there's also the era of prime Duncan, Parker, and Ginobili playing under Greg Popovich for the San Antonio Spurs. So there were much better teams than the Raptors in that era. Not to mention that LeBron was just coming up and growing into one of the best players in the NBA, willing his Cavaliers team that would have been a lottery team without him all the way to an NBA Finals. And maybe the Raptors could have gotten better players to come to Toronto to play with Vince, to play with T-Mac if they had stayed longer, because it would have been more attractive for players to come play with those guys. But let's be honest, though I do not blame the management fully for Tracy McGrady leaving, it wasn't a great management, let's be honest. And with that poor management, it would have been very difficult for them to attract any high quality players to come play in Canada. It's also important to remember that the market for basketball in Canada is still very small relative to the rest of the NBA. It's just the fact of the matter is people don't necessarily want to come to Canada to play basketball. Even after an NBA championship, that stigma still exists, and I really do not understand why. Obviously, the market is significantly growing, and it has grown exponentially since that NBA championship. But we got to remember, this is mid 2000s. Early 2000s, it was a horrible market for the NBA in Canada. The Vancouver Grizzlies had just gone under basically and moved to Memphis. So imagine how bad that market was for Toronto basketball. It would have been damn near impossible to get good players to come to Toronto if not through the draft. And we wouldn't have had that Chris Bosh pick if Tracy McGrady had stayed. We would have been too good for that. So there wouldn't have been great help for those two players playing together in Toronto. And because neither of them over the course of their career showed their ability to elevate the level of their team to that next championship level with that true championship DNA to push your team. Maybe they aren't as talented as the other team on paper, but because of you, you can elevate your teammates and push them onwards, overcome that obstacle into the championship. Because neither of them ever showed that over the course of their career, and they would never have really had the help around them to excel in the NBA, there's no way that the Toronto Raptors would have been able to overcome the legendary teams of that era. They definitely would have had a decent degree of success, especially playing in the Eastern Conference. They would have probably gotten to an Eastern Conference final, but I think that's about it because they'd probably run into the Pistons at that point, or even the earlier version of the New Jersey Nets. I recognize again that they were one Vince Carter buzzer-beating three-pointer away from a conference final, but that wasn't a tremendous 76ers team that they lost to either. I know they had AI in his prime, and AI was MVP that year, if I'm not mistaken, but he didn't really have a ton of help around him. It was a one-man show, and AI was so good that he could be that one man, but you know, if you're a talented Raptors team, talented enough to push on, you should be able to overcome maybe a team like that in a close game. Again, recognizing the greatness of AI, a top 3 or 4 shooting guard of all time for me, but the Raptors could never really kick on with Vince Carter. Allen Iverson is the kind of talent that Vince Carter needed to have or needed to be close to having in order for the Raptors to have been able to win a championship with Tracy McGrady and Vince Carter. That's how they would have been able to elevate that level into a final. But again, neither of them over the course of their entire career ever proved that they were able to have the ability to do such a thing. And I know Raptors fans may not want to hear this, but this is the reality. Both of them needed to be a Robin to a proper Batman, but they were both that Robin caliber type player. And the Raptors never had the marketability to acquire that Batman type player, that elite player, because they had no market power. I mean, these two players, Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady, really don't have a lot of accolades to show for their career. I mean, Vince Carter only has the mere 2 All-NBA appearances, and Tracy McGrady, 7 All-NBA appearances in an injury-ridden career, as well as 2 scoring titles. That is a lot more impressive than what Vince Carter had to show over his career. And Tracy McGrady, a top 10 shooting guard of all time, but he was always that volume scorer, just got his points, and he did it tremendously. But is that the kind of play style that you need for a single player to elevate the level of their team? I don't think it is. I think you need a bit of a more selfless play style. Not to knock Tracy McGrady, but he needed that second player. He was never good enough to be the sole player or the Batman player, that number 1 option on a championship caliber roster. But the question of if the Raptors could have won the championship with Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady, it really needs to stop being asked. You know, we're not the Montreal Expos looking back on what if this had happened, could we have won a championship, because we did win a championship. We the champs for a reason. We won the NBA championship in 2019. We don't have to worry about the what ifs of the past because we have the Larry O'Brien. There are a lot of franchises who do not have that elusive trophy. They have never won an NBA championship. Some never even got to a final before. We fixed our management. We fixed our ability to draft players, and we have the best executive in the NBA at the moment. Every team frothing at the mouth for the potential chance of getting him to come to their team, Masai Ujiri. We are the reigning champs. It is time to forget the past and enjoy the present. That's all for this video. Comment down below if you think the Raptors would have won a championship if T-Mac had stayed and played with Vince Carter for a longer period of time. But please like the video if you like and subscribe to Amateur Hour Sports for more content just like this. As well, hit that notification bell. We post 4 times a week. If you have any suggestions for any future videos that you may want to see on the channel, please do not hesitate to comment those down below and I'll put them into consideration. At the end of the day, I believe what I say, and if you disagree, that's okay. See you again next time.